Thank you very much for joining us here today for the first of our Living History series for 2013. As Nicola mentioned, one of my responsibilities here at the museum is our ongoing oral history project. And this is a dynamic and growing project that we add about 100 new recordings to each year, talking to people from around the world about their memories of President Kennedy, the assassination, and the history and culture of the time period. And every so often we find an extraordinary voice that emerges in our oral history collection, and we like to invite those individuals to come and speak before an audience. And that's why we do these living history programs. And so I'm thrilled that you're here today to talk with me and talk with Bill McElvaney about his social activism in the 1960s in both civil rights and in opposition to the Vietnam War. And we're going to begin our story today really in the 50s, in 1959, when you founded St. Stephen in the city of Mesquite, but you weren't appointed to a church that actually existed. Tell us the story there.
Well, I like to say the bishop appointed me to a vacant lot on Oates Drive in Mesquite. So I surveyed about 1,700 homes in about 2.5 weeks, just knocking on doors trying to find either some Methodists or other folks that wanted to be part of a new church. So that's how we got started. We met in a Lamar Elementary School, I believe it was, until we built our building.
And this is a very distinctive building. It still exists, and I believe I've heard you recall that it's the first freeform church building in the United States?
Paul Tillich agreed with that, and it was a new construction of concrete blocks without mortar, sprayed with a substance called arcolithics. It was pretty experimental and kind of scary, but it seemed to have worked out.
It wasn't long before you started to get involved with things in Mesquite and make a name for yourself. What awareness at this time in the late 50s, early 60s did you have about desegregation of schools?
Well, as a citizen of Dallas, and in that case Mesquite, you were aware of the struggle going on in civil rights. And so for me, the key factors were biblical text, which had to do with justice. Martin Luther King remains a very important person in my own faith development and history. I learned a lot from King, and then somehow I guess I had enough common sense to seek out mentors. Maybe people with disabilities, women, people of color, people from the third world, sometimes in person, sometimes in reading their lectures or listening to them. And in effect, if I have a personal contact with them, I'll just say, teach me the ABCs of your social reality. Or in other words, what's it like to walk in your shoes? And really that's been the way I've tried to learn, just sort of sitting at the feet of other people and teach me what it's like to be in your situation. So that was a key element in my development about civil rights and about justice issues.
And you had some awareness of desegregation at Perkins at SMU, Perkins School of Theology.
We did. It's a remarkable story that's unknown to many people. Dean Merriman Cunningham was dean when I went to Perkins in 1954. In 1952, he had recruited 5 African American students. Some of you might know some of those names. But they graduated on time in 1955. But now in 1952, he recruited what he thought of as a kind of a critical mass of 5 students, so there wouldn't be just 1 or 2. We're talking 1952, 2 years before Brown and the Board of Education, 3 years before Rosa Parks and the Montgomery, Alabama bus boycott. We're talking 7 years before the Greensboro sit-ins in 1960. We're talking like 11 years before the I Have a Dream, the March on Washington. So this was the first voluntary, either call it integration or desegregation, which is usually related to a court order, voluntary of a major institution in the South. And it's a relatively unknown story, and Dean Cunningham wrote about a 30-page book that tells that story. So that was happening while I was a student at Perkins. So I went in 54. Some of you might know the name Cecil Williams of the Glad Urban Foundation. He was one of those 5 students recruited. So that was happening in Dallas during all the time of segregation.
Well, to set the context for where you are at St. Stephen in Mesquite, Mesquite's a suburb of Dallas. It's part of Dallas County. And at that time, in 1959, all African-American elementary school students went to the all-black Carver Elementary, and the few high school students, African-American high school students, were bused out of Mesquite to the nearby community of Forney, Texas. So that was the situation when you took over at St. Stephen, and African-Americans made up about 1% of the population of Mesquite at that time. But you were unhappy with the situation, and you actually went to Carver to take a look at it. Tell us about that.
Well, what happened was Mesquite was sort of a developing metropolis, but a lot of rural areas still there. So this was sort of out in common terminology, sort of in the boonies, you might say. So he said, "Would you like to see the school?" And I said, "I'd be interested in seeing it." So I went with Bob Thompson, and what we found was a 3-room schoolhouse for 8 grades, for elementary and what we call middle school today. No playground equipment, no sidewalk, no American flag. And so I'm saying to myself, you know, this is unconscionable in our city. So I took this up with board members at St. Stephen, because this is not a preacher issue, it's a human issue, it's a justice issue. And I'll be forever grateful to folks at St. Stephen who said, yeah, we have to do something, but what do we do? So we decided to see if we could visit some of the African-American, we would call them today, African-American parents, and they were kind of scattered. The first thing you learn about doing justice, or at least that we did at that time, is that this has a lot to do with lack of transparency and visibility. And so we went and told them what we had seen, what we experienced, and so they said they would take it under advisement. When we left the meeting, I said, "Gentlemen," they were all men, I said, "we will see you in court." And I think at that time I said, "You're in violation of the United States Constitution." They were really in violation of Brown and the Board of Education. So I went outside, and I had the 2 lay members with me, and we hadn't talked about a lawsuit. And they said, "Lawsuit? Where did that come from?" So I thought maybe I might try to blame it on the Holy Spirit, but I thought, well, that won't work. But you know, within 48 hours, I had a call from Ralph Poteet, who was chair of the school board. Ralph died this last year. It was in the paper. And he said, "We'd like to talk." And I said, "Ralph, that's great. That's what we've been wanting to do." So we talked about it. In the meantime, I think you indicated we had been up to Forney, because they shipped the high school students up to Forney. They knew something about busing a long time ago. And they were not allowed in the Mesquite school system. So anyway, there was also the issue, what's going to happen to black teachers? There's just a lot of issues here that are involved in doing justice work, lots of parts of the puzzle, you might say. So at any rate, the Mesquite school system did begin an integration system. It was around 65 and 6, if my memory is correct. So the point, though, I want to make, that I have always said when dealing with this, is that as far as I was concerned, we were not dealing with evil men. We were dealing with an evil system. We all get caught up in certain systems in which we osmose certain values from the culture itself, sometimes unknowingly. And so I imagine that Ralph and some of his colleagues got some pretty heavy stuff around the town square. You know, like, "Ralph, this isn't who we are, this isn't what we do." But they took it upon and they made it happen. And I'm personally pleased today that a high school is named Ralph Poteet in Mesquite, Texas.
I want to point out that Mesquite did begin a stair-step integration plan, but really after about 2 years, they just decided to, as this newspaper headline indicates, they agreed to total mixing, and it's my understanding that Mesquite was one of the first school districts in the state of Texas to fully integrate and to do away with a stair-step plan. And I interviewed Dr. Poteet a few years ago, and he indicated, somewhat grudgingly, that you clearly played a part in that happening. And so kudos to you, sir, for that. I want to move on because you didn't stay at St. Stephen for very long in Mesquite. You moved to Dallas and you took over at North Haven Methodist Church. And what brought you to North Haven? And tell us a little bit about the congregation there.
Well, I don't know whether I took over or not, but but I was appointed to North Haven by Bishop Kenneth Pope. That was in 1967, yeah. And so North Haven was also a very progressive congregation under one of my predecessors, Bill Holmes. And so it was a good fit for me, and I think a good fit for North Haven. So we had other issues to take on, including beginning in about '67, the Vietnam War.
North Haven, just to set the scene for us, you did some interesting things there involving music and dance, and you really made it come alive. Tell us a little bit about some of the activities you would do that set you apart from other churches.
Well, maybe we helped it come further alive. It was already a very alive church, so we did some things in worship that were a little bit different, maybe using the dance. I had restarted dance in worship at St. Stephen with my dear friend Jerry Bywaters Cochran. Jerry went to Juilliard in New York when I went to Union Theological Seminary after Perkins. So we kind of reinstituted what might be called sacred dance or religious dance at St. Stephen. And so then they came to North Haven after I was there a while, so we sort of got that going in North Haven. But we had a group of dancers, I think Fran's in one of those pictures, and several others that people might know. So we just tried to kind of liven it up a little bit, and we had that opportunity to do that.
Mm-hmm. And then comes September 1967. I'm going to flash on the screen here your scripture notes for each of your sermons, and if we scroll down this list to September of 1967, we just see one word, and it's Vietnam. You came out against the Vietnam War, which was a surprising revelation. Tell us how you came to publicly denounce the war, and what motivated you to use the pulpit for that?
Like a lot of Americans, I didn't know what I thought about the Vietnam War at first. There were already others who were taking up that cause in various ways. There were two things that I read besides biblical text that were really important to me. One of them was called The Arrogance of Power by Senator William Fulbright of Arkansas. That was a key reading for me, and it really opened up a whole lot of new ways of thinking for me about the war. And then there was an article in the Atlantic Monthly. It was by the retired Commandant of the United States Marine Corps, General David Shoup, and he called it the New American Militarism, how we were using napalm and really destroying villages in order to save them, as William Calley said later in Vietnam. So I just began to read and study and mix that with biblical text, and just felt like this was not in our best interest. We lost over 58,000 Americans, as you know, in that war, and I felt it was a very immoral war, a wasteful war, although I want to say that our people who went into that in good faith. I don't want to in any way take on their sense of going to war, but you had a situation in Martin Luther King. It was really about 1965 when King, against the advice of some of his advisors, also came out against the war because he connected poverty and racism and war all together. He connected those dots. So if you were a young white college student, you probably could get a deferment. But if you were an African American student or person, you probably couldn't. So I mean, there were basic injustices to start with about the war. So I felt I had to take it on, and I became active in Clergy and Laity Concerned About the War. It's called CALC for short. It was a national ecumenical organization taking on the Vietnam War and protesting.
Now, you came from a very prominent family in Dallas. Your father was a prominent banker and was chair of the Board of Trustees at Southern Methodist University for a number of years. Was it odd for his son to take this sort of radical position? And what did your parents think about it?
Well, he thought it was odd. I didn't. But the story about that is that my dad and I could always talk about it. And we ended up having a service down at First Methodist Church. It was actually a peaceful, nonviolent protest, as all our protests were. And we got the late, of blessed memory, Rabbi Levi Olin involved. And my folks were very much impressed with Levi Olin. And so it was up to me to call Rabbi Olin to see if he could be with us. And we had to change the date a couple of times, and a couple of churches kind of canceled out on us, so we did manage to have it at First Methodist, as it turned out. And I'll never forget, about the third time, embarrassingly calling Rabbi Olin, he said, "Bill, whenever you have this, I will be there." You know, that is one heck of a commitment from a Christian standpoint, from a big steeple preacher. This was a rabbi from Temple Emmanuel. So he came and he spoke. He was the keynote speaker. Well, it turned out my folks were so impressed with Rabbi Olin, they figured out if it was okay with Rabbi Olin, it was okay for me to be against the war. So that's how it became okay in our family.
You preached those 2 sermons in September of 1967. How did your congregation at North Haven respond to that?
They responded in a very mixed fashion. I had a lot of support, for which I was immensely grateful. Our lay leader that Sunday greeted me at the back of the church and never came back and accused me of sedition. And I have to tell you, I knew sedition was bad, but I didn't know exactly how to define it. So I had to go look it up in a dictionary just to be sure what I was being accused of. But as I say, he never came back. But we had lots of support for that at North Haven. But what I learned was that some people were further along in their thinking about race issues than they were about Uncle Sam and national issues. This was kind of a sacred cow for some people that were okay with changes within racism. That was something I had to learn myself, that this is where a lot of people were. But all in all, I felt we had good support.
Dealey Plaza became a gathering point for people during the Vietnam War, both in support of what was taking place and those like you who were in opposition. Why do you think the site of a presidential assassination was chosen for these demonstrations?
Well, that's a good question. I have to think some more about it. It was certainly a place that was well known in the Dallas area. And so we had about, I think there's something like about 400 people that gathered there I guess that was Ferris Plaza, wasn't it?
Yeah, well, but there were, starting in
Dealey.
66, yeah, there were weekly silent protests in Dealey Plaza.
The protest that some of us were in, the American Nazi Party was circling the plaza area there. And we had a retired military, General William Wallace Ford, who was retired from Amherst, I think. It was an anti-ABM rally, so he was the keynote speaker. And then we had Rabbi Herschel Jaffe of Temple Shalom, Richard Dietz, Fellowship of Reconciliation, and I, as we're kind of the token early speakers, you might say. So anyway, while the general was speaking, this person broke out of the crowd. I'll never forget his words. "Hitler was right," and he threw red paint on the general while he was speaking. And fortunately, it was water-based paint, so we could get it off. But anyway, those of you who are Unitarians or not Unitarians will remember Ken Jemry and Ho Seltzer. They came out of the crowd and tackled this guy, and the police came up and hauled him off in a paddy wagon. So we cleaned the general off, and he went back and finished his speech. So it was quite an event.
We have a picture up there from the aftermath of that. You can see paint on Reverend McElvaney's suit coat there. This was one of the most prominent marches and rallies that took place during the Vietnam War. It was a 16-mile march that started in Grand Prairie at the Ling Timco Vought Aerospace Corporation, came all the way to Dallas, passed through Dealey Plaza, and ended up right there in front of the Dallas Morning News. Got a lot of publicity for that. Did you ever feel threatened in that kind of a way again? Did you ever receive threatening phone calls or anything like that?
Well, we got some threatening phone calls. A fan can tell you about that, and both on the race issue and on the war, but that's just part of it. It happens. It can be pretty frightening, and you sort of watch your step a little bit. But it didn't change anything that I was doing or saying.
No regrets at all about coming out in opposition?
As a matter of fact, when I look back on some of the protests we've done, I guess I feel they were never probably strong enough. I've never thought they were too strong, but maybe not strong enough. But we encouraged people to think about serious issues, and we drew people into conversation, which I think is important. And I remember a comment that the Georgia congressman, who am I thinking of, Fran? No, the one that Bill DuBose told us about, John Lewis. John Lewis, he's active in Congress of Georgia. He said the most important thing in his mind about the civil rights movement was not just the open accommodations and the voting law and those things, but that we tried to teach a younger generation something about nonviolence. And God knows we need that in this world of violence that we have. And so we taught a younger generation how to think differently about how to approach different problems in our society, namely through nonviolent ways and means.
We have just really touched upon a couple aspects of your activism. I know that you were also a champion for fair housing and participated in a march in 1968, and it continues really to the present day. I remember seeing you out here in the plaza in 2007 as part of a march against the Iraq War, and you maintained this very active schedule. You were on Stephen Colbert denouncing the George Bush Library at SMU.
And the Policy Institute.
And the Policy Institute. What fuels this lifelong pursuit of social justice?
Well, I'll go back to biblical text, that if you read biblical text in both the so-called Old Testament or Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, you learn pretty fast that God is passionate about social justice. And so those of us who take on that mantle would do well also to be passionate about social justice. That's just part of who we become. You have these passages, for example, in Micah and in Amos, where the prophets are saying, take away the noise of your solemn assemblies. I don't want all of your rams and your rivers of oil and all your sacrifices and that kind of thing, but let justice roll down like an ever-flowing stream in righteousness. So what you don't find anywhere in Scripture is where Yahweh or God is interpreted as saying, you're spending too much time doing justice and not enough time praising me. You don't find that in Scripture. You find quite the opposite. And so that's sort of the basic foundation of faith for many of us. And I think many of us grow up in the church not realizing that justice is part of the message. We were pretty good on charity issues, and I think that's important too. But justice becomes more important, and we learn something about the need for justice by doing charitable work at times. Why do we have all these hungry people? Why do we have the situations we have in a society of plenty? So there's that, and then all the mentors I mentioned, too many of them to mention. So that's been basic to it too. But King was kind of my guiding light during the civil rights movement.
I want to give you a chance to ask some questions of Reverend McElvaney. You should have received little note cards when you came in today. If you've written a question out, please pass that to either side so we can collect those and begin to go through them. We'll try to get to as many questions as we can, or if you haven't written a question and you've thought of one, please jot it down real quick. You talked about people that inspired you. Would you include John F. Kennedy among those that served as an inspiration?
To some degree, but in a much more limited way than King. Much more limited way. I think we keep discovering new things about our leaders, some good and some bad perhaps, but Kennedy did not impact me the way King did, or people like John Lewis or some of the others that were in the movements.
Where were you on the day of the assassination?
I was in a store in Mesquite, Texas, when I was pastor. I was pastor at St. Stephen. I don't remember the name of the store, but they broadcast it there in the store, and I went home immediately and made some calls and received some calls. But I think most of us who were old enough at least to be around in those days pretty well remember where we were. And if I may just say quickly, for those of you who came knowing something in my background. I'd just like to thank you for coming today. I really appreciate your being here. Thank you so much.
All right. Do we have some question cards? Let me go ahead and take those, and if there's some more, you can get them. All right. All right. Bill, so here are some questions from our audience today. Though racism is better now, what is the racism issue of today?
I think the race issue today largely has to do with economics. That we have such a high level of poverty in our country, where we have so much wealth, that's a major issue that we're concerned about and try to work on. We've done some of the voting rights, even though that was attacked in certain ways in the last election, of making it more difficult. We saw that happen in a number of states. We saw it happen in the state of Florida, where I think people really rose up against the attempts to make it more difficult to vote. So voting rights is still an issue, but I think the economic issue is important. When we talk about biblical justice, we're talking about procedural justice, that is to say in the law courts, but we're also talking about distributive justice. How are the goods of a society distributed in a certain way in that society? And so those are deep issues, they're complex issues, and they're very difficult issues, but they're with us.
All right, another question. What is your opinion on the new civil rights movement for gay rights?
Well, I'm very much in support of all the civil rights movement for gay and lesbian people. There are issues about what you want to call it, whether you want to call it civil rights or human rights or whatever. But I think one of the great excitements in our culture today is the development of the gay and civil rights, if you want to call it that. It's been very important. It's been important to our church at North Haven to be what we United Methodists call a reconciling congregation, where everybody is welcome, and there are other churches here that have plowed some of that ground too. So I'm really grateful for that. I've learned a lot from my gay and lesbian brothers and sisters about what it's like to be in their shoes. I'm delighted to see the church and our society making some progress in this area. So when we at North Haven, when we began to move toward becoming a reconciling congregation, I remember we asked people, what brings you back to North Haven some? And this would be true of some of the other congregations represented here. And I remember one of our members saying, well, it saved me or delivered me from my homophobia. And one of our gay members spoke up right away and said, yes, and it saved me from my heterophobia, because it works both ways. And when you get that, then you're making some progress with your understanding of these issues. But we've heard so much pain from our brothers and sisters in the church about rejection, and so it's time now to be, as our pastor Eric has said recently, instead of trying to save the world, let's try to love the world. And I really like that, because that's the best way to go about doing things.
The Reverend Bill Holmes, who was your predecessor at North Haven, preached a very controversial sermon after the Kennedy assassination. Do you remember what you preached about that Sunday?
Yes, I think most of us preached on the assassination. I will say he was not my, there was, Jim Hares was there 1 year between us, and so there was 1 year of separation there. But we had a clergy group called the Dirty Dozen, and we're still hanging out. We've lost some of our members along the way, but I think all of us preached on the assassination that Sunday. Bill's was a superb sermon, and it was developed, it was picked up by the news media. That's why it became very well known throughout the country in a way. And so he paid some prices for doing that. He was threatened, and he had to leave home, And some of us in the Dirty Dozen, of course, were supportive and wanted to hang out with Bill and Nancy in different ways that we could. But I thought he did our community a distinct service by raising the question, in the name of God, what kind of community we have become. The favorite term dealing with this in my mind has always been from the late Rabbi Abraham Heschel. And Heschel said that in this kind of situation, that some are guilty and all are responsible. And I really like that. That is to say, there's major questions about whether or not Oswald is the guilty one. I recognize that there are whole issues involving that. But even if you assume that he's the guilty one, we had a climate in Dallas which promoted the kind of thing that happened. Look at the Dallas Morning News editorial during those days. Were lots to be desired. The major changes have occurred there. We've made some progress.
Had John F. Kennedy lived, do you think that would have affected the outcome of the Vietnam War?
I think it probably would have. I think that he was moving towards some more negotiating ways of dealing with the Soviet Union, and some of you know more about that than I do. Some of you are well read on that, much more than I am. But I think it certainly could have.
We'll take one more question today, and this one just really struck me. Has anyone ever told you that you remind them of President Jimmy Carter?
All the way to a cab driver in Rome.
So that does happen a lot?
It happened when he was during those days, not as much now. But I would try to when I was at St. Paul's School of Theology, we have a community meal, so I'd try to slip on my deep Southern accent if I could, and play the Carter role for a moment just for fun. Yeah, I was told that quite a bit.
Wow, wonderful. Well, I want to thank you very much for being here today. If you would, please fill out the questionnaires, the evaluation forms. They help us plan future programming here at the museum. And please join me in thanking Reverend Bill McElvaney for being here today.